Oh, thank you. That's much better. I'm very excited to begin this semester's Crease Noon lecture series with a talk by Professor Catherine Stoner, the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and Professor of Political Science at Stanford University. Before I introduce Professor Stoner and her talk today, I just want to quickly go over our upcoming events so you can make sure that these are on your radar and hopefully on your calendar. Yes, very good. So just coming up in the next couple of weeks, on January 27th, that's already this Friday, the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia is hosting a film and discussion of the film Kalinindorf. That is at the top of the screen over here, with the directors Yuri Kaparulin and Les Kasyanov. This is a 29-minute film from 2020. And Yuri Kaparulin will be, who's a Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia Scholar at Risk Fellow, will be joining us for that discussion. And you can see the sponsors of that event are the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, our center, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies. And that will be on the 5th floor of Weiser Hall, so 5 floors below us. Next week, on Tuesday, January 31st, there will be a lecture sponsored by the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies entitled The Rise and Fall of Free Speech in Russia by Elena Milashina, a journalist and WCED Freedoms Under Fire residency fellow. That is sponsored by the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, CREASE, the Wallace House Center for Journalists, and the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, and that will be exactly where we are now, here on the 10th floor of Weiser Hall. And then 1 week following, on February 8th at noon, we will have our next lecture in this series, the Crease Noon lecture series, Playing with Words, Talking About War, delivered by Professor Ainsley Morse of Dartmouth College. And that is something that is being sponsored by, an event sponsored by CREASE, as well as the Department of Comparative Literature, and that will once again be on the 5th floor. So we will enjoy the existential loop that is area studies between the 2 floors. So that's what we have coming up just in the immediate future, but in the immediate present, I'm very happy to welcome Catherine Stoner, who is, as I said, the director of the Mosbacher Director and Senior Fellow at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Freeman Spogli Institution, and the Freeman Spogli Institution for International Studies at Stanford University. She teaches in the Department of Political Science and in the program on international relations, as well as in the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy program. Before joining Stanford University, she was on the faculty at Princeton for almost a decade, jointly appointed in politics as well as in the Woodrow Wilson School for International and Public Affairs. And at Princeton, she received the Ralph Glendening Preceptorship awarded to outstanding junior faculty. She has also served as a visiting faculty member in political science at Columbia, as well as at McGill, and has had fellowships at Harvard and at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I'm not going to go over all of her publications, which are extensive, but she is the editor and or co-author of, I believe, 5 books. Most recently, Transitions to Democracy, A Comparative Perspective, written and edited with Michael McFaul and published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2013. And Autocracy and Democracy in the Post-Communist World, co-edited with Valerie Bunce and Michael McFaul, published by Cambridge in 2010. Her talk today, which is entitled, as you can see, Making Autocracy Worse, The End of the Myth of Authoritarian Competence in Putin's Russia, is a consideration of how the increasingly autocratic methods of autocratic regimes can be bad not just for their neighbors, but for the autocracies themselves, and how autocracy can seem to implode on itself. The deepening of autocracy in Russia that is the making of Russian civic life more repressive, is a result of more than a decade of declining regime performance, she argues. The war in Ukraine has now exploded the already ailing myth of competency that Putin has perpetuated since the early 2000s and has made his regime vulnerable to elite and social pressures. If you've been reading just the coverage of tensions between the Kremlin and Prigozhin in the last week, it seems to be playing out live. So I'm very excited to hear what Professor Stoner has to say about these developments. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you. Thanks.
Oh, one other thing I almost forgot. This event is co-sponsored by the Department of Political Science. Yes? Thank you. Sorry. Important to note.
Right,
Please.
exactly. I think my microphone's on, but it's not clear to me. Is it?
It should be. Let me do this.
I-
Last nitpick.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks, Ben, very much for mentioning all of the donors as well in some of my titles. I know that they always appreciate that. That's my only good slide. Let me just warn you in advance. And actually, I should also mention, I've written things since 2013. There was a book that came out that I hope is in the Michigan bookstore, and I'll be checking, that came out in 2021 called Russia Resurrected, Its Power and Purpose, yeah, and stuff like that. All right, so this talk, as Ben said, I should have just let you keep going because you were actually doing a better job than I might do in the talk itself, is called Making Autocracy Worse. And some of you may have read, well, if you're as old as well, I know my former sort of roommate, Pauline, will remember a book called Making Democracy Work, written by Robert Putnam. So he was actually one of my dissertation advisors, and I wrote a book for my dissertation that I guess was published in 1995 or 96, I can't remember, a long time ago, many children ago. And it was called Making Democracy Work. It was about local government in Italy. And I was working on local government in Russia for my dissertation. And he said, you should call this book Making Democracy Worse, because of the punchline of that book. So now at least I can say Making Autocracy Worse, use that as a paper title. But as Ben said, yes, it's the argument of this paper, which is going to come out, I think, in the next month or so, in the Journal of Democracy, is basically just blowing up this myth of authoritarian competence in Russia. And so I have some data, but I'm not going to show you a lot of it. And let me just warn you, there will be no experiments or randomized control trials. I'm sorry for the disappointment, but we'll just get that out of the way now. Okay, so the argument is basically that Russian autocracy has worsened over time, and as Ben said, that it has gotten more repressive. But we actually haven't really sort of noted this in a lot of the measures of autocracy. So for example, if you look at Freedom House, don't do it now, wait until I'm done. If you looked at Freedom House numbers, you would see that this is not really captured even when they go to their 0 to 100 scale. They only show about a 10% change between 2006 and 2022 in the quality of Russian autocracy. It has been called a consolidated authoritarian system since 2006 or so. But over time, clearly, the quality of autocracy has changed. It has become more repressive over time, more reliant on the use of fear to keep social pressures under control than on just controlling information or spin. And those are terms I'm using that come from a book by Guriev and Treisman called Spin Dictators. And it's a really good book, except it came out, and they're both really good friends of mine. And actually, Dan was at Stanford visiting with us for the year just as the book came out. And just as the book starts by telling you about how Putin is really a spin dictator and modern dictatorships are different than Stalin or Hitler's type dictatorship in that they don't use repression as much. And and so now we see Putin using a lot more repression. Now, he's no Stalin, no Hitler, despite what you may hear on various news channels or from former secretaries of state here in the United States. But clearly the quality of autocracy has changed. It has become more repressive over time, using more of that than just a narrative to support it alone. So when did this change begin, and why did it occur are the two driving questions of the paper, and then what are the implications? So we can see some signals earlier, but really it starts in earnest, the downward slope from about 2011-12, when Putin announces that he will come back into the Russian presidency. He does this, remember, in the autumn of 2011. He does it without consultation, evidently, of the Russian people. It never occurs to him that he will lose the election, because he won't, of course. Then there are big protests. You'll remember that in Bolotnaya Square against the Duma elections, which are viewed as fraudulent, and almost certainly were, of course. I should take out the almost certainly. That's my Canadian side coming out. They were fraudulent. They're bold. And then protests continue in 2012, as we might remember, and there were a lot of arrests afterwards, long prison sentences for pretty young people who had participated, use of police weaponry against those protesters. I'm going to tell you the rest of the story between what's happening in that period, in the 9 or 10 years. We see an acceleration of this in 2021 when Alexei Navalny comes back 2 years ago now, after being poisoned by the state. He, of course, comes back from Germany, and he is taken immediately into custody. Again, we see big mobilization on the street. And then a crackdown on Navalny's organization. A lot of them go into exile, no longer live in Russia anymore. And then we see even more repression following the invasion of Ukraine in February of last year. So the question is, why did this happen? So my argument is going to be that there's a decline in governing competence over time, and the myth of governing competence was no longer supported by the narrative. Reality slapped it in the face. And so the implication of this is that if the war effort continues to go badly for Putin's regime, then we can expect more repression at home, or a worsening of autocracy. So the bottom line up front, the bluff, as people like to say, in the US government is the Russian case really shows us how failed governance can lead to more repressive autocracies. And it tells us a little bit, perhaps, about regime survival strategies. So I'm going to use Russia as a case of that. But for area specialists in the room, I'm going to sink pretty deeply into Russia. So enough political science. So as I said, we tend not to measure the changing quality of autocracy or catch the changing nature of autocracy, perhaps. And I gave you the example of Freedom House, but we could look at the other measures as well. We can see, though, that Russia has become more repressive over time. So this, the argument of Guriev and Treisman in Spin Dictators, the book's called, is that modern autocrats are different than your Stalins, your Hitlers, your Mussolinis, in that they use information. And Putin, actually, they open the book version of this argument. They have several articles as well. Putin is kind of the quintessential spin dictator for them. He's there. This is the motivator of this book. They resort more to informational authoritarianism. They rely more on controlling the information environment, but not full censorship. Now, that's obviously something that's changed since the start of the war in Ukraine. They rely more on spinning a narrative of competency in governance, and they use different forms of information technology to attract rather than force societal and elite compliance. So their argument is basically all about perception, societal and elite perception of governing competence. And so I think this is actually a little bit of a misread. there was some competence, governing competence, in the first 8 or so years of Putin's presidency. There was some happy accidents, and I have a friend who calls Putin Vladimir the Lucky because of the growth in oil prices, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But there was also some basic competence, good policy. And definitely in the wake of the tumult of the 1990s, you can see why this may have actually attracted social support. So it wasn't necessarily a myth of competence so much at that point, nor was there as much spin of a narrative because there didn't need to be, at least at that point. So until recently, if you follow Guriev and Treisman, Putinism is thought to be more of a spin dictatorship. That after this, the competency wanes, and I'll talk about that in a moment, more than using fear or repression to keep other elites and society compliant. But as I said, it has become more repressive or worse over time, so how has that changed and why? And so I can't cover the whole paper in the period of time that I really should talk. So I'll just give you kind of the outline of the arguments here. So at first, autocratization or increased autocratization in Russia is stealthy after 2000 when Putin becomes president. And it's accomplished through incremental erosion of civil liberties, of sort of limiting the opposition through administrative means, basically, making it too hard for them to actually get representation in the Duma, beginning gradually kicking things like TV Rain off TV channels, then kicking them out of their studio, then relegating them to just YouTube, for example, and now all the way out of the country. There was a rebound somewhat after Putin castled positions between 2008 and 2011 or so under Medvedev, who, remember, he's kind of a different guy now, evidently. Lots of theories about that. One is alcohol. That he's drunkenly using his Telegram channel. He's definitely puffier than he used to be. Sorry if you're watching, Dimitri. They've already banned me, so I can say anything. I feel really quite unrestrained now. He's now maniacally nationalist. He hates us, and he hates Ukrainians, he tells us. But he was a different guy between 2008 and 2011. Or maybe he was the same guy, he's just a really good actor, one way or the other. But after those protests that I mentioned in Bolotnaya against Putin coming back into power, against those stolen Duma elections where things have to look better for united Russia, for Putin, evidently, and those large protests, things become much less tolerant of opposition political parties, of opposition viewpoints, much not further, but further restrictions on independent media, self-censorship. The boundaries have changed in terms of what you can say and who is allowed on television, and strict oversight of courts resumes with greater intensity. Of course, the things like the foreign agents law, I go through in the paper. This is now expanded, of course, but it starts in about roughly this period, and we get a narrowing of who is the opposition, and then targeting, even assassination attempts. One is successful with Boris Nemtsov, unfortunately, and an attempt against Alexei Navalny, as we know, in August of 2020, and then the dramatic return and jailing, and he is now completely marginalized politically within Russia, at least, as he sits in a labor camp for 9 years and perhaps as long as 20, who knows exactly, or longer, what will happen. There also seems to be a concerted attempt to deny him medical care and health care as well. Subsequently, there were crackdowns against demonstrations, and ultimately this whole process, which I'm just skating over quickly, ends in the closure of Memorial, which was founded in 1987, an organization, partly the reason for which Gorbachev received a Nobel Prize, and of course Memorial itself shared a Nobel Prize just last year in 2022. So really the definitive end of what begins with Gorbachev and perestroika and glasnost, the sort of difficult period of the 1990s under Yeltsin, where politics were much more contentious and contested, at least. It's relative, so I'm not going to make the argument that this was a consolidated liberal democracy, but relatively speaking, very different. And then following the invasion on February 24th of last year, virtually all independent Russian media sources have been closed. Echo Moskvy, of course, Dozhd, gone, Navalny's organization gone, moved, Novaya Gazeta, Genial Bats, they're all gone now out of Russia because their leadership faced certain arrest, or worse. Severe fines are levied against anyone who criticizes the special military operation in Ukraine, right? You can't call it a war unless you're Putin. He accidentally called it a war, but no fine there. Oops, right? He got tired, I guess. Even holding up just a blank sheet of paper can get you arrested, and pretty much everywhere. Complaining in or saying the truth in a classroom can get a 19-year-old basically kicked out of school and questioned by the police and perhaps spending time in jail. Russian civil society was largely crushed shortly after the invasion, at least large demonstrations of protest, where 14,000 were arrested in the weeks immediately following the invasion. So basically, the modernizing, liberalizing experiment that Gorbachev seeded, sprouted under Yeltsin, has withered and now died under Putin. But his autocracy has also changed. It's gotten worse. Okay, I have a feeling I don't really need to convince many people of that, but we can come back to it. So why is this? Well, as I hinted at the beginning, and has been previewed handily, there was a myth of competence, and there was actual real competence in the early Putin years. And partly why I wanted to mention Russia Resurrected is because there is that argument in that book. So the narrative of competence and the mythology of competence was really something that came up a little bit later, right? So in contrast to the 1990s, Putin looked competent because the 1990s were very difficult, right? Very crowded policy agenda for Boris Yeltsin, inherited just a terrible economic situation, which I'll come back to in a moment, had a recalcitrant Supreme Soviet that came out of a Congress of People's Deputies, and then he ultimately fires tank shells on the White House where that Supreme Soviet met, writes a new constitution creating the super presidency in December of 1993. But even in this new Duma he creates, the loyal opposition is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. They twice attempt to impeach him. There's a very difficult and unpopular, popular with some if you made a lot of money, privatization process that creates extreme wealth inequalities, launches Russia on that path. And bankruptcies, social discontent, uncertainty, a very difficult time for people who lived through it. And I think this partly explains why in surveys we see people who are over 55 much more supportive of the regime today than people who did not live through that period. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So anyone, almost, I don't want to be mistaken for praising Putin in any way, almost anyone, I used to say a trained monkey, could have governed better than that. Once those big issues were resolved, then even before Putin came in to office, by 1999, we start getting positive growth. And as we'll see, things change a lot with oil prices going up and revenue coming in. So basically, I'm sure you've read all this, so I'm not going to go back to it. Between 2003 and 2008, we see huge growth in the Russian economy. People's real incomes increase, double, triple year on year. 7% increase in GDP over time in those 6 years. Then what we see is the global economic crisis that hits everybody in the autumn of 2008. And it hits Russia especially hard. If I could act out GDP here. It's 1999, 2003, it goes up to 8, and then global economic crisis, it goes down. Then it comes back up. But it never gets that high again. And so the kind of myth of competence has exploded even when Medvedev is president, right, in 2010, 2011. Now, there is some smart policy that prevents some very, very bad things from happening in the Russian economy. Pretty independent central bank chairwoman comes in, who's still central bank chairwoman, purportedly tried to resign but wasn't allowed to. This could probably help us explain why Putin comes back into office in 2012. Because it wasn't always certain that he would. He was purportedly exercising 3 or 4 hours a day, kind of enjoyed being prime minister. He had his little bailiwick of things he cared about, but Dima was allowed to do a few new things. So in other country contexts, we get populism, right? And that's I think probably most people are familiar with this argument in comparative literature on Europe, for example, in the United States. We start to see swings to the right in attitudes of publics in Western Europe, in the United States, and gradually, this becomes Donald Trump by 2016. In Russia, we see discontent too. And in this period, Putin's approval ratings go down significantly. And we see a deepening autocratization as a result. We see a rising narrative of a myth of competency. And this is where we start to see more spin. But gradually, we also start to see more fear, the use of repressive tools to ensure greater control over society. So worsening governance led to worsening autocracy in Russia. And the war in Ukraine, which isn't going so well so far for Russia, if the standard was to have quickly taken Kyiv, to have gotten Zelensky to leave, to have replaced Zelensky with a puppet government, and for the Ukrainian military to put down its weapons, and for the Russian military to be welcomed in with bouquets of roses. None of that obviously happened. It was not over in a week, and here we are almost a full year later. So I think the war in Ukraine has deepened and accelerated this deepening autocratization process, and we can expect that if Russia continues to do badly, things will get even worse at home in terms of repression. So there are lots of other explanations that we might turn to explain deepening autocracy in Russia. And so the paper goes through some of these. One is that Russia is exceptional. It will never be anything but an autocracy. It missed the Enlightenment, was lightly touched by the Industrial Revolution, 70 years of communism. We should ask perhaps not why Russia's transition toward a more liberalized politics failed, but really why it ever would have succeeded in the first place, given this history. So I don't like, most political scientists don't like cultural determinism. We can argue with historians and others about this, and anthropologists, but I find that unsatisfying, and we'll get to why in a moment. Statistically, too, if you look at comparative literature on autocracies, Barbara Geddes and some of her co-authors have argued that most autocracies just transition to different forms of autocracy, not democracy. 2/3 of the time, that's the case. She uses a global data set. But in the 1990s, conditions were actually not that bad for what theories might predict in terms of political liberalization, and in the early 2000s. So what were they? Well, one argument is that no, they weren't. Russian society wasn't ready, and that kind of follows from the historical argument. But actually, here again, relatively speaking, in the 1990s and early 2000s, actually society was, comparatively speaking, ready for liberalized politics. And we see high mobilization. I could show you, and I have in lectures for my undergraduate course on Russia, photos of huge demonstrations of people yelling, "Da, loy, KPSS," right? Down, I was even there, yelling down, maybe Pauline too, down with the Communist Party, just covering Manezhnaya Ploshchad, which you can't do anymore because of the shopping center you fall through. And actually you can't do anymore because you'll be arrested, of course. So it wasn't that Russians are, sluggish or passive. They revolt. They've done that many times in the last century. And they were definitely not passive and sluggish in the late 1980s and early 1990s. They were also highly educated, and urbanized, which is another, if you believe modernization theory, and a lot of people don't, Seymour Martin Lipset's argument, that would sort of help in terms of support and understanding of a more open politics. It was also, in terms of income and wealth, the average per capita was much higher than the threshold that Adam Jaworski at NYU and others have established of about, I think it's now $14,000 US GDP per capita for a transition to stick to democracy or more open politics. We don't even have to go full democracy. And in the 1990s, we had elites committed to a great degree, I'm qualifying that, to a political process that was competitive, right? So I mentioned to you twice there were attempts to impeach Yeltsin. He was pressed to cancel the presidential elections of 1996. He didn't. Now, they may not have been completely free and fair, but compared to what we have now, they look better. And here are just some examples, and Natalia, you can probably talk more about this, of Russians independent from the state, proving themselves very capable of mobilizing against the regime. And these later few years, 2017, 18, 21, and even last year, were despite regime efforts to demobilize them and to separate them off from the more liberal West. So it's clear that Russians aren't passive. They don't have an allergy to being freer than they are now, but they may be more fearful of the state than they were 10 years ago, which may also help explain some of the demobilization that we see. Two other unsatisfying popular arguments in trying to explain why Russia is an autocracy and a deepening autocracy today is, of course, the resource curse. Everyone, if you listen to, and I don't recommend it, Rachel Maddow, she has this, and she's fine, whatever. But she has this book called Blowout. Yeah, don't read it. Come on, Rachel. It's basically, Russia's problem is oil. If Russia didn't have oil, think about it, right? Do you think it'd be a democracy today under Putin? Show of hands, anyone? Right, so it isn't oil, right? So the counterfactual is pretty strong. I didn't see a lot of people jumping up at this. Actually, it could have been if oil prices were higher under Yeltsin. Imagine that counterfactual, right? In the 1990s, the average price of oil was $17 a barrel. By 2008, I think it got to about $124 a barrel under Putin. So what if Yeltsin had had that in the 90s? Think of how things might have gone. Complete different perception with people, I think, about economic performance. Anyway, that's just something to think about. So Russia is not a traditionally resource-cursed state in the way that the theory, in fact, I have people in our department, Steve Haber is one of them, even doubts there's such a thing as a resource curse. And he has a really nice paper that he wrote a couple of years ago that argues that, look, if you had political institutions before you find oil, Norway, Canada, dare I say as a Canadian, then you find oil, then you're going to have functioning political institutions after. If you don't, before you find oil, and then you find oil, you're not going to have them after. So it isn't necessarily the oil that is doing all the damage. It's not helpful. But Russia has very few of the attending pathologies. And here we have to remember correlation doesn't mean causation, right? The fact that Russia today under Vladimir Putin has a strong security state isn't because of oil. It's because he wants it to have a strong security state. He also comes out of obviously a security background. When you come into a new job, often you bring people that you know from your previous line of work. Guess what? His previous line of work was, as we all know, in the security services. So while it looks like, check, that's what a resource-cursed state would do, the reason for it in Russia is a little bit different. It also, and this is where we get some good governance and good policy, actually has, as I'm sure most in this crowd will know, a pretty robust national wealth fund, which has a budgetary rule. They can dip into it from time to time. Sometimes the rule is bent, but this is independent of their foreign reserves. And this is to pave over the cracks in the boom and bust cycle, so that's good management. Not to say that contracts are not corrupt and that his cronies don't get preference. Of course they do, and Russia would be much, much better off if that weren't the case, right? So not good governance, but maybe good enough. It has a low debt to GDP ratio, so it didn't get into the pattern that a lot of oil resource-cursed states do, where they get dependent on the revenues from exporting this valuable resource, and then when the price dips, they borrow money so they can keep paying off the security services or the religious police if you're Saudi Arabia, or everybody in the royal family. Russia didn't get into that. It has a comparatively low debt to GDP ratio, lower than ours actually here in the United States. Still had a manufacturing industry, as Thane Gustafsson notes in several of his books. Didn't make consumer goods, but made a lot of other things. And so when you know, the famous quote from John McCain that it's a gas station with nukes, it's a little more than that. And my other book, Russia Resurrected, makes that point, that we're underestimating. If John McCain thinks that, and people in the US Senate think that, and people in the National Intelligence Council think that, we're going to be surprised shortly. And I hate to say I was right because I've been wrong in other books, but in that one I think I was right. Also big aluminum producer, one of the world's biggest, second biggest exporter of weaponry in the world. We here in the United States are number one. Something Russian economists were particularly proud of, and policymakers, was that by 2017, Russia was the world's leading exporter of all things wheat. And one of the reasons of all things was because in the Soviet period, they were importing wheat. That's one reason Russia inherited so much debt in 1992 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So recovering for sure. And then foreign reserves that it doesn't really have access to anymore, well, at least half of them had been built up as well. So that is not the story of a resource-cursed state at all. And then another unsatisfying popular argument I just tried to take apart is that Putin's an ex-KGB agent, and so what do you expect? And again, actually John McCain was a decent guy, so I shouldn't bash him, but he did say this. When George W. Bush said, I looked into his eyes and saw his soul, and I saw a man who cared about his country. Remember that? Condi Rice, who's actually happens to be my neighbor on the Stanford campus, and a colleague said, yeah, he was really off script. We were in the back of the room going, oh, don't say that. And McCain said, I look in his eyes and I see KGB. But the thing is that Putin, yes, is an ex-KGB agent. There's a bit of a debate about how effective a KGB agent he was. He was never higher than a lieutenant colonel until for a year he served as head of the FSB under Yeltsin. But he was not always anti-liberal. He was not always anti-West. Angela Stent and others have noted that he was among the first, perhaps the first foreign leader to call George W. Bush and express condolences for 9/11. He thought of himself as also having a domestic terror problem because of the Chechen war that had reignited shortly before then, and so looked to the U.S. to be a partner. You can also find lots of quotes, unfortunately, in my book that I mentioned, of him saying, I don't see NATO as a particular threat. I don't see it as particularly necessary, but I don't see it as a threat. So there's been rather a change over time. He didn't start out this way, but his background as an ex-KGB agent hasn't changed. So that can't really be the explanation here. Okay, already did this. Okay, so my argument is instead the importance of authoritarian competence, and this goes beyond just Russia, but other modern autocrats as well, right? They have to be, they do rely to some degree on some aspect of performance legitimacy for at least some share of the population. So Putin came into office promising to restore order in comparison to the disorder of the 1990s. And so we can understand why people may have been suspicious, certainly. We focus a lot on looking at liberal politicians here in the West when we analyze Russia, but we don't look at sort of average people in an autocracy in the day-to-day, right? If your life was very unstable, if you were bartering soap in order to feed your family, if you were selling your possessions outside the metro station in downtown Moscow, then someone who comes in and says, all that gambling, all those prostitutes. I once walked in at Pushkin Square. I was heading to a hotel in about 1995 or 96, and the metro was just filled with these beautiful young women in very tight lycra that was too short, basically openly being given instructions by a man I assumed was their pimp to go out onto the streets. I mean, there was like, there was under regulation, under enforcement of law in the 1990s, and it's because the agenda, the policy agenda, was just so huge, right? You're transforming this massive economy across 11 time zones. You're trying to build a political system that is competitive. You're trying to privatize as well, and so regulation, rule of law was obviously suffered. So not surprisingly, here comes a guy who says, I'm going to bring you some stability. I'm going to bring you some predictability. We're going to have dictatorship of law. Alex Matovsky has written a really interesting book that says, guess what? It's stability, stupid. People wanted stability. And so if we try to understand why would, not the Moscow intellectual support Putin, well, there you go, right? You get stability, and real incomes begin to go up. GDP begins to go up. The state is seen doing things. Roadways are getting built. New buildings are going up. People are living better. There's some degree of governance competence. And as Adam Jaworski has noted, any order is better than disorder. And there was a lot of disorder. So the regime was, for a time, basically competent, relatively speaking. Now, less and less pluralistic over time. But until 2008 or so, basically, there was some degree of governing competence. There was corruption. Could have done much, much better. Could have allowed a lot more transparency, a lot more tolerance. But there were some popular policies, like, putting Khodorkovsky in jail, outrageous to us here in the West, divesting him quickly of his property, tremendously popular with the average Ivan or Ivanka out in Sverdlovsk. Well, maybe Sverdlovsk's not a good example. Let's take Irkutsk instead. So Russia, as a result, and this again is part of the argument of Russia Resurrected, traveled a long way down the road of economic and social modernization. Now, it could have traveled much farther had it had better governance, had there been less corruption, and over time there was less petty corruption. I remember in the mid to late 1990s, coming from Sheremetyevo Airport into my apartment in downtown Moscow, that my driver was frequently pulled over by GAI, the traffic cops. And one great stop was the cop pulls him over. You might remember this, right? They stood by the side of the road and they waved you down with these. He's got a piece of PVC pipe, like white pipe that you might use for plumbing, and some Sharpie marks on it. And he puts it in. I said to Sergei, my driver, like, what's going on? Because we weren't speeding. And he goes, oh, it's an environmental check. He takes the PVC pipe literally with, Sharpie marks a la Trump, and he puts them in the exhaust of our car and says, oh my God, you're polluting too much. There's too much. And so, Sergei had to pay 1,000 rubles or whatever to move on. This sort of thing stops in the early to mid 2000s, right? The prizes are bigger. The corruption is at a different level. It's grand corruption, and that gets worse and worse, right? Cronyism, preferential awarding of contracts, outright theft of state property. All of that happens at the higher level, but that petty day-to-day corruption makes life a little bit easier for some people at least. There's also, as I said, central bank independence, and she's allowed to implement some good macroeconomic policy, and high global oil prices, which of course Putin takes credit for all the good things that flowed from that to Russia, but he didn't cause it. The day before the invasion of Ukraine, the country had paid off its inherited debts from the Soviet period and from the 1990s. It had built this sizable foreign reserves and for the most part maintained not budget deficits. No longer were they unable to pay pensions and wages as happened in the 1990s, some might remember, but actually a budget surplus. It's not a perfect picture. Authoritarian competence became more a myth than a reality over time. And so really after the global economic crisis, it's more and more myth than reality. And so we see the spin narrative start to warm up after that. Here's just a quick look from, these are actually from Russian Federal State Statistics Service. Oh, my pointer doesn't work. But if my pointer worked, I would show you how, this is just percentage change. Maybe I can use this one. No, I cannot. Okay, percentage change here in real wage growth, and real wages are different than just nominal wages. Nominal wages, real wages is nominal wage rate divided by the consumer price index times 100%. So it's actually how your wages feel on the ground. Right now here in the United States, because of inflation, they don't feel as good, right? So what we see in Russia, 1999, we have, or 98 really, we have the sort of real down dip. Then they start to go up. And we see they go down even as Russian GDP by 2005 has gone way up. Wages pop down, real wages. They go up again, but never, and then they go way down. See the global economic crisis, 2008-9, just before that 2010 bar. They pop up again, but notice that the trajectory, that black line, it's not an optical illusion, it's slightly bent that way. That's one indicator of a problem. This period where things were going pretty well is over. There are other indicators that the paper goes through as well. Corruption is a problem. Inequality is a problem. Inequality not just of income, but of wealth, right? And so we get the 1% in Russia controls about 60% of the wealth. And this gets people annoyed over time. So we can look here at what happens as Putin returns to the Kremlin in 2011 and 12. As I've said, those protests, his approval rating drops. I'm going to show you that in a second. There's some rallying around the flag. Henry Hale has written on this after the initial seizure of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. But a new narrative has been initiated at this point to bolster or distract from what is now not a reality of competency, but a myth of competency. And gradually we see repression added to that with things like the Foreign Agents Law and undesirable organizations are kicked out from Russia. Here's his approval rating. So some of this you see, disapproval is blue, approval is black. And so you can see this in particular around 2010, 11, 12, all the way up to the seizure of Crimea. There's the rallying around the flag. It goes up, stays up, and then just as COVID is hitting, look what's happening again. As he's running again for the president in 2018, it's low, and then going into Ukraine, it bumps up again. I'm not suggesting a simple wag the dog scenario. There's more to it than that. But I would suggest that one of the aspects of the narrative of authoritarian competence is what you don't want, Russians, is Ukraine. It's a disaster. It's disorganized. Here we have order. And so autocrats want to convince their societies that the alternative is undesirable. It's easier than using force. But they'll use force when they need to as well. And I think that's what we're seeing with Putin. So the regime response to the falling myth of competence is that we gradually get more overt repression than reliance on spinning information in a narrative, although they do that too. We get a new phase with the Foreign Agents Law, a war on civil society, basically, increased repression for infractions that had not previously been punished. And I was reading an article yesterday in Medusa that was an interview with one of the lawyers of Agora, the human rights organization, saying, we don't even know right now in 2023 what people might be arrested for. Things that were okay 4 or 5 years ago, or even 4 or 5 months ago, suddenly are not. So this era of unpredictability perpetuates fear, right, and paranoia. So when we look at opinion polls within Russia on support for the regime and Putin, how much of that is generated by fear, and how much is it genuine because of the narrative of look what the alternative is, I think it's hard to know. The other thing is trying to separate off in this period, 2012 onward, the liberal opposition, such as it was, from the rest of society. And Sam Green and Graham Robertson have a great book called Putin v. the People, and one of their arguments is exactly this using wedge issues to demobilize parts of society that might have followed the liberal, sort of more liberal politicians. One is the Pussy Riot affair. Okay, the punk hymn, the anti-Putin punk hymn, lasted 30 seconds. You would have thought they had taken over that church the way the Russian press and even President Putin commented on it. But it was a very useful wedge issue for what was basically, elements of a conservative society, right? It was demobilizing effectively as well. Putin then uses the narrative of presenting himself as a conservative Orthodox champion. This divorced man, father of 5, 6, 7 children by 2 or 3, 4 different women. He is a champion of orthodoxy. He is happy to use the church as a crutch, even sometimes wearing a cross. Using the law against protesters who take to the streets in the spring of 2012, but not against elites who steal openly from the state, unless they're a challenge to the regime or an embarrassment, which is also a challenge. So the war in Ukraine, and I'll try and finish here, has basically ended the myth of authoritarian competence in Russia. And the economy is now in recession, so the gains of the last 30 years completely erased in that respect. They've gone from having budget surpluses to budget deficits, an almost 60% decline in the automobile production and sales. Only Russian and Chinese cars are available, almost 12% inflation toward the end of last year, million or so or more fleeing, and the other things, Russia is increasingly isolated. Now, a spin dictator is supposed to be, one of the tricks is open to the outside world. Don't use too much censorship. Those rules have now been broken. So this is a fear dictatorship more than it is an informational or spin dictatorship. The paper goes on, and I don't want to talk too much more, looking at whether Russians are now fearful or believers in the spin, or both. And the answer is both. But it is very hard to understand high public approval ratings in Russia, or in any autocracy, right? So if someone calls you on the phone or comes to your door and asks you, and this is what happens with Levada, and asks you, do you support President Putin? A lot, a little, more, a little than a lot, very little, or not at all, or can't say. Well, knowing that the rules are constantly changing, and who is this person coming to my door, what might you do? Not answer, or I don't want to be noticed, I'll answer, but I don't care what I say. Yeah, I support him. So we may be getting preference falsification, we probably are, but there is generationally a big difference in support for Putin and support for the war in Ukraine. So what we see is people who didn't go through the 1990s, people in particular under 35, but really 18 to 24, are almost regardless of where they live, although there are differences, urban and rural, east and west of Russia, are much less supportive of the war and much less supportive of Putin. So the desire for stability is not as strong as it is perhaps for their parents or for their grandparents, is what we see. So there are different clever ways of trying to get at this too. The list experiments, which we can talk about later, which seem to indicate that there is preference falsification. Also, on the street interviews, support seems to be lower. Could be preference falsification as well. Some people, including Vladimir Milov and others, have looked at not only the generational differences, but looking at things like mood and hope and anxiety, so feelings. And all of those are going up. That is, getting more negative, more anxious, less hope for the future, and more pursuing, interest in pursuing peace. So we're getting up over 50%. That's an indirect way of saying I don't actually support the war. It's very hard to square that with high support figures. But you could do that even if you're afraid. Yes, I want peace. I'm not saying I'm against the war. It's just that I want peace. I'm against violence. But I support the Russian military. I support the president. And I support the war. So anyway, here we come to the end. Oh, one thing I wanted to make sure I said here. So dictators don't fall because of spin or a failing spin alone, right? So spin may be important. Governance, performance legitimacy is really important. Not just perception of it, but actual performance legitimacy. And I think that's something that Treisman and Guriev overlook. And a failure to suppress political alternatives. That's why they fall. So what has happened? Political alternatives basically don't exist in Russia anymore because of the perpetuation of fear, because of the perpetuation of a narrative that Russia is under siege, and this is the only way to protect ourselves, but heightened fear, to be sure. Okay, so here's the importance of the myth, and this I think is my last slide, happily. They can fail on all things but one, and that is performance legitimacy and preventing an alternative to the current regime. Not just creating a perception of spin, but actually governing matters. But when performance legitimacy declines, they resort first to spin, and so we saw that in a narrative, and softer forms of repression, and then gradually the balance shifts. Ukraine is chaos. That's the alternative to me and my autocracy. We don't want that in Russia. And you can almost get direct quotes from Putin that are exactly that. So that helps, I think, explain why some support is probably genuine, right? We're comparing the 1990s to now. We're comparing Ukraine. Looks like chaos. Well, it's chaos. They're being bombed, right? Their infrastructure is being bombed. And Russia has been working under Putin to undermine Ukraine independence for 10, 15, 20 years. But when performance legitimacy truly falters, the myth is undermined as well by a not-so-rosy reality, then the regime's survival response is to revert to repression and to make autocracy worse. So that's where I'll stop. I think we still have time for a few questions, right? Thanks.
Oh, there we go. Thank you very much, Professor Stoner. And again, I don't know if I'm visible on the screen, but we are able to take questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. That, as you can see there, we actually already have one question, and we will get to questions from those of you in the audience. But since the question that came in over Zoom is from one of your co-authors, Valerie Bunce.
Hi, Val.
She was asking over the Q&A whether there is a what she was asking about was whether there is a family resemblance between right-wing populist authoritarianism that we see elsewhere around the world in the mid-2000 teens and Putin's governing ideology, because you present very well, I think, that something somewhat different is going on, and yet it's easy for us to see that there are clear resonances between Putin and Erdogan and Fidesz in Hungary, et cetera. So.
Right. Some of Putin's buddies, too. So, hi, Val. I wish we could see you. And I think there is a family resemblance. And so, you know, in which direction is it imitative or of Putin? So some would say that it is, that Hungary started under Fidesz some of the same sorts of policies, foreign agents laws and whatnot, imitating what Putin was doing. And Erdogan too. So Putin has a kind of love-hate relationship with Erdogan. They seem to have big blowouts. Plane is shot down, and then all is forgiven. And now as well, Erdogan is kind of playing both sides of the field. But definitely, yes, I think there is a pathology, which is kind of what led me to the, hey, you know, as I listened to my colleagues, including Anna Zhizmalabuze, who used to be here at Michigan, we got her. She loves not having the weather like this, but it wasn't I didn't tell you that. Anyway, she's miserable. I'm sure she'd love to come back, but she won't. So, you know, their arguments are about populism, right, and the rise of populism. And I actually at one point wrote a paper, is Putin a populist, right-wing populist? And certainly does share some of those pathologies, right, you know, anti-elite. It's kind of hard for him, though, because he's been the elite. He's been in power for 23 years now. This is 23rd or 24th year, 23rd. But the anti-elite is anti-West. Those are the elites. Gay Europe, as he calls it. Overly permissive. You know, liberalism is dead, he told the Financial Times in an interview. So definitely, you know, I think, yes, it is part of a pattern. But not exactly the same in that he doesn't have, you know, it's hard for him to argue against elites. Although, frankly, you could have said this of Trump too, right? A billionaire who's railing against liberal, privileged elites in the name of the working class. Putin has tried the same thing, basically, yeah, but more successful, I think, in using repression because the institutions are just not, you know, as weak as ours are. They so far have held up.
Thank you. Good, because I have a question too. I'm going to restrain myself. So please, we'll begin over here and we'll work our way across the room.
My name is Oksana Chabanyuk. I'm a scholar at risk fellow at the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia from Kharkiv, Ukraine.
Oh, nice to meet you.
You told that the war in Ukraine has deepened and accelerated the process of worsening autocracy in Russia. In this case, I have two questions. First is how can we, I mean Ukrainians, use this worsening of Russian autocracy for Ukraine to win the war? And the second, do you think is the war in Ukraine is the start of collapse of Russia?
So, so maybe I'll take the second question first, because the first one I've puzzled over a bit as well, and I think Ukrainians have better ideas than I do probably on that. Is it the beginning of the end? Well, normatively, I wish that I could say definitively yes. But if you look at the comparative evidence, the most likely outcome, I had a small piece on this in the Washington Post and Monkey Cage a few months ago. Most likely outcome is that should Putin fall, because some people think Prigozhin, for example, is I think he's having his moment. Let me put it that way. I think Putin could get rid of him in a second if he wanted.
And no one has a moment for very long. Having a moment is a dangerous thing.
If I were him, I wouldn't go above the 4th floor or so in an apartment building or hotel. I don't know. Could happen. Seems to happen. 4th floor and above, people fall out of the windows. So there could be, some sort of elite coup attempt against him. If it were successful, who would most likely benefit? Well, I don't think it's elites or oligarchs who've been divested of property abroad, because to the extent they have anything left, they're still dependent on Putin for keeping that. And I don't think it would be the Prigozhins or Kadyrov, who's also having a moment. So what about someone in defense? Not Shoigu himself, not Gerasimov, although now he's maybe someone below that, because you have to think that the people in the armed forces, like the professional Russian military, and most of the Russian military is not conscript army, right? They had a big military reform where they professionalized, and those guys are, they're not looking good. They cannot be happy. They have their best troops have been slaughtered. They were not told in advance, evidently, that they were going into Ukraine. They were unprepared, and they looked terrible. And now they have to, quickly train, not exactly reservists, right? So maybe something like that could happen. But then what's the most likely outcome for Russia? A different form of autocracy, unfortunately, given that it's not obvious yet who could lead any kind of spontaneous mass uprising. And although we love to follow those, you would think from watching the news that actually Ukraine's experience is the most frequent when we see turnover of autocratic regimes. But in fact, it's the exception, not the rule. That's only like 1 out of 8 times. Do street protests bring down a government? And again, this is Getty's. This is not my own research. So what can Ukrainians do? I think we have to find ways to get information to Russians, and that's the kind of best alternative, information that they can believe, right? That's very difficult. But I just had the president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, come visit me at Stanford a few months ago. They're trying, right? And Ukrainians may be more successful at that than we would be, for example, using those ties that Putin says you're supposed to be a brotherly nation, right? Trying to use those in reverse. I suppose would be helpful. In terms of the US and Europe, maybe, and Ukrainians won't like this, and Ukrainian refugees should definitely have priority. But there are Russians who are not supportive of this, right? And so some of those who have left or who want to leave should be welcomed. They will go back, hopefully, when this regime does end, or when there's a moment of vulnerability. And just as we saw diaspora do in Ukraine, we saw it in the Baltics, they will be ready to go back, hopefully, and run the country in a different way. But I think there's no easy, quick solution. I mean, trying to fight that information narrative is probably the best thing Ukrainians can do. Zelensky, your president's a very effective communicator, though.
Hello. Thank you very much for your lecture. My name is Yuri Kaparulin. I'm also a scholar at risk fellow at the Wiser Center. And
From where? From Kharkiv?
from Kherson.
Oh.
Kherson, yes.
Yeah.
And my question is, when you talk about making the autocracy worse in Russian policy, do you mean in the nearest future Russia will stay in this theoretical frames of theory of autocracy, or it's moving to worse political system to totalitarian society, or not? Or it will anyway stay in autocracy theoretical frames? Thank you.
So I'm guessing that so for me, the difference between totalitarianism and authoritarianism is that I think totalitarianism is a kind of an ideal type, abstract Hannah Arendt concept. That there's, and we saw this even, probably as close as we came to seeing it empirically under Stalin in the 1930s or even 1930s, or under Hitler at certain points. Even that was not total control, right? And they had institutions that Mr. Putin does not fortunately have, right? So there isn't a party that Stalin had. There isn't, the use of repression and a police state. That's certainly heightened. But as day-to-day life in that autocracy, I think again why it's so frustrating. We feel like we see a lot of passivity in Russian society. Is people are just trying to get along, right? And it's very different from the 1930s when you really had to watch what you say. People are now watching what they say, but I wouldn't say it's totalitarian. But I also don't think totalitarianism is achievable per se. What I am saying is it's going to become, the worse things get for Russia in Ukraine, and the worse its internal economic situation gets, and the more social dislocation and instability that results from that, the more repressive that regime will get. So it'll get closer and closer perhaps to that ideal type. But yeah, that's what I would expect. And the question is, do Russians have, enough Russians, have a revolutionary threshold, if you will, that gets hit as a result, and are willing to then take collective action and come out onto the streets in the way Ukrainians have in the past? That's a big question mark. And so that's why actually I think it's very important to look at what's happening to not our liberal friends who are leaving, so much as looking at the average person and what's happening in their lives, and their expression of mood and the future, as opposed to the pat questions of support or not, country moving in the right direction or not, because that's basically a support question. How do you feel? Are you anxious? Why? And then think about why we may be seeing higher support and preference falsification as a result, because it's fear now.
Thank you, Catherine, so much for your talk. I wanted to just sort of push you a little bit to clarify the relationship between repression, use of repression, and information control in determining the quality of an autocracy. At some points, I heard you as saying, or I understood you as saying, the more repression relative to the use of information control or narrative promotion, let's say, spin, the worse the quality of the autocracy. And at other times, it's felt like they were both increasing, and that was the problem. And it seems to me like the latter is more accurate in terms of...
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
Great. So thank you for clarifying that.
You don't have to choose. You can have a mixed strategy if you're Putin.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that seems to me exactly what he's doing. He's doubling down on the
Right.
narrative, the state narrative, and he's exporting it increasingly. to the other post-communist states, including
And just in
Kazakhstan, where there
case-
are large populations of Russians.
And just in case that fails, we'll demobilize any dissenters. And one of the ways we'll do that, there are many ways we can do it, but one of the ways we can threaten their jobs, we can make them dependent on my regime, and the other way we can do it is we can throw them in jail, or we can kill them. And so why not do all those things at the same time? But what I'm noting is that, yes, the narrative is getting more and more hysterical,
Yes.
and Medvedev is one good example of that. But at the same time, repression is also going up. There's no, it's a mixed strategy.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump in with my own question, if that's okay. I was really fascinated by your discussion of the perception or myth of competence. And I'm wondering how, I'm not a political scientist, how do you as a political scientist disentangle the appearance of competence, or for that matter, the appearance of a diminished effectiveness in governance, from the symptom of a preceding lack of competence, by which I mean, it's quite typical whenever we have negative externalities, like, say, a global pandemic, or in this case, a war, even though it's a war of their own making. It's typical for us then to see in those externalities the exposure of a preceding problem, something that our lack of preparation for a global pandemic, or in the case of the Russian war, it's only when they actually have to start up the tanks that they learn that for the last 25 years people have been stripping the tanks for parts, right? So that would suggest an incompetence that had been ongoing, but only at the inflection point does the symptom become real. It actually made me think of the cliche that we often say as an explanation to undergraduates or younger people: why did people support Stalin or Mussolini? And we say, well, the cliche is because they made the trains run on time. And it suddenly occurred to me, I've never checked to see whether the trains ran on time. So I'm curious how you disentangle those things.
Well, so this is, I think, the sort of genius of fear and spin together, right? You don't know what you don't know, until you observe it for yourself, right? So first I would dispute that for 25 years the tanks were stripped. They actually have very good, and I hate to mention again, but the book that you didn't mention goes through that. They actually had very good technical competence. It's just that the military bureaucracy is just as corrupt as many other bureaucracies in Russia, and so the ability to actually use the technical competence and even to spend the money that they were allotted in the right way, well, it turns out there's the myth of competence, right? On paper, they look good. In practice, well, they couldn't get it together. Why? Well, yes, you're right. Commanders at the time, and even soldiers, are stripping down and selling things off as they're going into war. Mostly commanders, and so you get young Russian soldiers who hate them, right? And we're picking up, and the Ukrainians are picking up interceptions of telephone calls saying, I hate these, guys, and they're nowhere to be seen, and blah, blah, blah. So how do you disentangle it? I think that Russians can disentangle it in day-to-day life, which is, in 2017, when I was visiting Moscow with a group of students, the Metropole was surprisingly inexpensive, and so Stanford put us there. It's not my fault. We arrived in the middle of a demonstration, and it was all young people on the streets, and it was in response to a video that Navalny had put together exposing Dima's, riches, and so what was interesting is that young people were protesting corruption, and then when you look at studies of Russian youth, and even polling, before this, 40% of young Russians in June, just before the pandemic, are saying they want to emigrate permanently. Why is that? Inequality, not just of wealth, but of opportunity, right? So if you're going to do something like invest in education, you got to believe that that's going to get you I'm guessing that you're doing a master's degree or whatever, PhD, because you think that's going to get you a higher paying job than if you just had left with a high school degree. And you'd be right here in the United States. You wouldn't necessarily be right in Russia. And that's because it's not a meritocracy. It's because who you know is going to get that higher paying job. Not in every circumstance, but in a lot of circumstances. And so a lot of the frustration we see from young people in Russia is that, right? That's not fair. That's fundamentally not fair. It's not right. So they can observe it every day. And in the daily humiliations of not being able to get your kid into that school or that job or yourself, right? And so I think gradually this eats away at the myth of competence. And one reason I wanted to show you real income is that's the myth of competence, right? It costs more. Life costs more. And yet, you know, I see these guys and their Dodges and houses and, you know, so what do you do in response to that? You cut off the source of information of the guys and their Dodges and houses. How many times do you think within Russia a palace for Putin was viewed? Like 3-4 million times? Well, that, you know, multiplies out so that a lot of people, how you respond to that depends on where you live and what your age is.
I'm afraid that even though we have a couple of questions, although you did cover the questions that are still sitting in the queue, I know that others had more questions, but we're already 25 minutes after the hour. So I'm going to, speaking cutting things off, I'm going to cut this off, though I do invite you to speak with Professor Stoner after we turn off the Zoom. And thank you all for joining us. Please, those of you who have to venture out into this Jack London-esque environment, please be careful, watch your step. It's going to be quite slippery, so please travel carefully. Thank you very much, and join me in
Ben. Thank you.
thanking Professor Stoner.
Thank you.